Today I'm going to talk about Genesis chapters 2 and 3. In fact, that's something of a misnomer, because the end of the first creation story, or at least the one that we encounter first when reading the Bible, whether it was written first is a different question, but the creation story that we refer to as the Genesis 1 creation story, in fact, runs from Genesis 1:1 through to Genesis chapter 2 verse 3, and the next one that follows after that in chronological order when reading through Genesis starts in Genesis 2:4. So I'll refer for convenience to Genesis chapters 2 and 3 and Genesis 1 versus Genesis 2 and 3 when referring to the different material in those chapters, but in fact the division does not correspond precisely to the division between the chapters, and hopefully most people are aware that in fact the divisions between verses, the divisions between chapters, are things which are not part of the original Hebrew text. They're things that were added on much later for the convenience of reference. In this case it doesn't make it convenient to refer to the two creation stories per se, but hopefully can use shorthand and refer to Genesis 2 and 3. And so today I'm going to focus on the account that we find focused in chapters 2 and 3. And one of the major questions that should be asked, which doesn't always come up for readers, particularly depending on what translation they're reading or whether certain features of the text are drawn to their attention, is whether this is a continuing story or a different one. Let me focus on some of the major differences, and some of them we'll come back to in more detail a bit later on. First, it's long been noted that there's a difference in the way that God is referred to in Genesis 1:1 through to 2:3, and in Genesis 2:4 and following. The divine name, which is usually pronounced as Yahweh, sometimes referred to as the Tetragrammaton because it has those 4 letters, which vowels are not added to in the Jewish tradition, and in fact the name is not pronounced. In Genesis 1, we only find the word Elohim, which means God. In fact, it's a plural form, but plural forms are used for abstract nouns, and so perhaps the best way of rendering this into English would be to say the deity, or something of that sort. Right? That's what that term would mean naturally in Hebrew. And so, in Genesis 1, using that term, right, simply the deity, the divine, we have this depiction of God transcendent, right, distant, creating through speech, and we'll come back to that. The very use of a divine name, a personal name for God, and you may not see that in the English text that you're using, unless you happen to be reading, say, the New Jerusalem Bible, because it has long been the tradition to render the divine name Yahweh as Lord in big capital letters. So wherever you see Lord in big capital letters in a Bible, what that denotes is that in the Hebrew text there's the divine name Yahweh. And that's a tradition, using Lord instead of Yahweh, that's a tradition that goes back to an effort to help people to avoid accidentally misusing the divine name. If you don't pronounce the divine name ever, right, if you never actually say Yahweh, then you're not likely to blurt it out when you stub your toe or hammer your thumb instead of a nail. And you can see that it works, because I'm guessing that most people who are listening to me talk about this have never actually used the divine name Yahweh as a swear word. And so, but that's the background to why we have Lord there. But that Lord in English can obscure something that's distinctive that comes about in chapters 2 and 3, which is the use of the divine name Yahweh. Another interesting difference is difference in duration. In chapter 2, right, verse 4, second sentence that starts halfway through that verse, it talks about in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. And so it talks about a single day, and the only reason to highlight this is because there are some people who make so much of the fact that there's reference to 6 days, and emphasis on taking that depiction of a divine work week literally. Here we have reference to God creating the world in a day, and this is a point at which it's worth noting how translations sometimes obscure some of the features that lead scholars to think that there are in fact two authors at work, two different creation accounts here. In some Bibles, you won't even find the word day in Genesis 2:4. And that is an expression of a conviction that this text is simply a continuation of the creation account in Genesis 1. But what the translators do when they obscure the fact that there is, when pressed literally, a discrepancy between the language, what they do is they cater to, and perhaps pander to, people who believe that the Bible should be taken literally and should always agree and there should be no contradictions or tensions in it. And so they actually reinforce that through the translation, which obscures things that might challenge that assumption. And we see that as well if we look at the order of creation. Right? And here too, different translations give different impressions. We're told that God sees that it's not good for the man to be alone, and so make him a helper. And then Genesis 2:19, in the New Revised Standard Version, so out of the ground the Lord God, Yahweh God, formed every animal of the field, every bird of the air, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. If you read a translation like the New International Version, it will say that every animal that the Lord God had created. And there's no distinction between those two tenses that we distinguish in English, and so it's not that the NIV is making the text say something that it couldn't possibly mean, but the translators are most definitely drawing a conclusion about the relationship between this chapter and what preceded it in chapter 1. And that decision that they make is then passed on to readers of the translation who don't even know that there is another possible way of understanding the text. And so in Genesis 2, taken at face value and translating the tenses in the simplest way, we would understand that at that point, right, God creates the human being. It's a different account of the creation of human beings and of animals and other living things, and that the order in Genesis chapter 2 is different than what we find in Genesis chapter 1. Another difference worth noting is humanity's relationship to the land. Genesis 1 has often been blamed for exploitation of the environment, this language of humanity being given dominion over living things and over the land. The truth is that this language doesn't need to be understood in that way, particularly when we consider that most scholars think that the Genesis 2 or Genesis 2 and 3 creation story predates the one in Genesis 1. And the one in Genesis 1 is usually dated, getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, but usually dated to the time of the Babylonian exile or the time after the Babylonian exile. And so if it's written for Israelites who are returning to their land after a generation of being away from it, they're sort of being given permission to go back and take control of that land in terms of cultivating it, turning it back from overgrown land into land that they can use. And so in that context, it seems far less detrimental to the environment. And in fact, we shouldn't blame this text for things that it could not envisage. It's only when one thinks that it's a timeless set of commands and a timeless treatment of its subject matter that we then have the problem of why it doesn't address what can happen when humanity has dominion over the land and has technology which allows humanity to devastate and destroy through its use and misuse, taking dominion. In Genesis 2 and 3, at any rate, we have an emphasis on human beings as Adam, and there's a play on words with Adamah, right, the Hebrew word for land or ground or soil, and so there's an emphasis on humanity's relationship to the land that's different, right? Not necessarily contradictory. Clearly, whoever put these two side by side in the biblical text, put them together in the text of Genesis, thought that one could appreciate both. But if they are distinct and noticeably distinct, then whoever put them together clearly thought that one could appreciate them in a way that wouldn't be troubled by the differences in detail. And so the attempt to insist that all the details must line up represents one way of approaching the text. it may be that the very inclusion of different creation stories in these early chapters is supposed to signal to the reader that a different approach is called for. Let's note one more difference between the creation accounts. As I said, in Genesis 1, God is depicted as transcendent, speaking and giving commands to the earth at times, the sea at times, to bring forth living things. God simply speaks, gives an order, and it happens. In chapter 2, the depiction of creation is much more hands-on, right? We might say metaphorically, God getting his hands dirty, working with earth, and forming with his hands, right? Touching things and creating almost like a potter. And whenever I think about this way that Genesis 2 depicts things, I'm always reminded of this cartoon from the Far Side, which depicts God making the snake. I'm not sure why I find this as amusing as I do, but anyone who's worked with clay or Play-Doh will probably remember making these long, thin things out of it. This language is presumably, most would agree, metaphorical, right? Just as the language of Genesis 1, right, doesn't necessarily mean God has literal vocal cords, and that there was a pre-existing atmosphere which would carry God's voice, and all these other things that one could, if one was determined to press literalism to its extremes, one might come up with. So let's move on to the story of Adam and Eve, as it's famously known. And some of the questions we might ask are, what kind of story is it? Is it supposed to be history? There are certainly those who insist that that's the case. Is it theology? A story in symbolic terms, intending to make a point about God and God's relationship to human beings. Is it etiology? And certainly elements of that seem to be in there. Why do snakes not have legs? Why is childbirth painful? These sorts of details. Since there are no historical witnesses that one could ever hope to have, approaching the text as history makes little sense, even just practically speaking. One would have to have varied accounts, one would have to have multiple sources in order for historians to be able to feel like they could draw any kind of conclusion. And so, I'm going to focus now on the text as literature, and focus, in particular, on symbolism within the text. There are very few who would deny that there's symbolism in this text. It talks about a tree of knowledge, sometimes rendered as the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but it's really tree of knowledge, good and evil. And so exactly the relationship between the knowledge, good and evil, how that should best be phrased is an interesting question in and of itself. The snake is often viewed as a symbol of Satan. And if you ask some people, would they, please give the account of Genesis as they know it, they might simply say that Satan, or the devil, tempted Adam and Eve. But of course, the text itself doesn't actually say that. Right? It doesn't say anything other than that the serpent tempted them, and it says that the serpent was a serpent. Genesis 3 verse 1, now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. It doesn't depict the tempter in the story as a supernatural being. That's something that's read in later. And one can understand why that was read in. Right? Serpents don't normally talk, right? And so seeing something more at work here is quite natural. But note that that is a clue to a non-literal reading of some of the details, right? And this draws to our attention an important point about genre, right? These texts are not introduced by a preface that says, please read these as history. And so there's nothing there that suggests that the appropriate response when you encounter a talking animal is to forget everything you've learned about literature, everything you've learned about stories that include talking animals, and interpret it literally and insist that it must be history. The very presence of such details should clue us into what kind of literature we're dealing with. Since I have a picture that has what looks like an apple in it, I should also mention that the apple, too, the idea that the fruit was an apple, is itself also an addition, an element of tradition that's not explicit in the text. And noting that, and noting the point about the snake, is important because it helps us to remember that it's very hard to realize where what the text actually says, explicitly says, ends, and where our traditions of interpretation begin. If we ask what else is symbolic in this story, right? we might go further than the snake. Some would say the fruit, right? Knowledge of good and evil is a symbol of good and evil. Tree of life is a symbol of life. Right? Not necessarily fruit that either would help one do very well on exams if one eats it, but also get one into a lot of trouble on the one hand, and a literal fruit that would allow one to live forever. For Christians reading this text, in the book of Revelation, it uses the language of tree of life, and uses the same word that sometimes is used for the cross as a tree. And so there seems to be multivalent and multifaceted symbolism there. But once again, treating that item that's mentioned in Genesis as a symbol. So what happens in this story? Right? There's the creation of Adam. Right? And while we're used to Adam as a name, right, in fact, Adam is the Hebrew word for human. I wonder how many people would understand this text differently if the main character was referred to in English as human. Right? We can use a capital H because we use capital letters for names, but it's not a name. We have the name Adam in English, but that comes from the biblical account. And in fact, Adam is not a name in Hebrew. It's a word. And so this character is called human. And that in itself raises the question of, is this a story about two first human beings, literally, historically, or is it a story told about first human beings in order to say something not about them exclusively, or not even about them scientifically or particularly or historically, but about what human existence is like? I often ask my students what would happen if, walking down the corridor after class, they suddenly saw a new button on the wall in one of the corridors in the building, and it was a big red button, and it had on it, "Do not push." If I ask them what do they think would happen sometime before the end of the day, most of them agree that at some point somebody would push it. And if we ask why is that the case, well, there's something about us, our curiosity, that can get us into trouble. Right? Taken as a literal story about two historical individuals, the text becomes problematic and a subject of debate. Treated as an analysis of what human beings are like and what kinds of things have been known to get us into trouble, the text seems to offer some insightful analysis. The serpent asks some questions. Right? He says, "Can't you eat of the fruit of the trees? Is this really prohibited?" And so it's those insinuating sorts of questions that have long gotten people into trouble. Right? Are you really not allowed to eat of any of the fruit? It's worded in such a way as to make it sound like you're being restricted access to something that's good. The woman is depicted as responding and saying that you're not allowed to eat or touch, right? And that in itself is a noteworthy difference from the actual command. And so it's interesting to note that in light of the rabbinic decision to prohibit the use of the divine name, right, to prevent people from getting into sin by pulling the boundary back a step, we see that here, but here it seems to get people into trouble. Right? Once they've touched it, they feel like they've already broken the command, and so then eating follows. Right? And there's been this huge build-up. Right? The serpent says, "You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil." It's an enormous build-up, God-like knowledge, and they eat of the fruit, and they know they're naked. It's something of a letdown. Coming of age, coming into possession of knowledge that's supposedly godlike knowledge, and what do they know? They know they're naked. And in fact, there's a play on words with the craftiness of the serpent there. And so the closest way we could render it in English is they thought they were going to be shrewd, and what they learned was that they were nude. The closest way we can get something of the play on words that's there in the Hebrew text rendered into English. A question I like to ask students, I've asked it semester after semester, and I never get a response that's really satisfactory, is, when did you first know you were naked? When did you first have that moment? I'm not asking when did you first have that dream where you're wandering around in public naked? Many of us can remember those, at least vaguely. But when did we go from people wandering around without clothes to people who feel the need to cover up? And when I ask, who is like the characters in the story who walk around naked and are not ashamed, right, at the start of the story, when I ask that, I'm always afraid that students are going to answer their roommate. That's not the answer I'm looking for. But Adam and Eve are depicted as being like children. Right? And at some point, right, they know they are naked, and they become responsible for their decisions, and there's this loss of innocence. And the story seems to be addressing a topic which myth and mythology has long been used to address. Those aspects of human existence which we can't put our finger on. Coming to know that we are naked. Going from being children who can be naked and unashamed or unabashed, like Adam and Eve at the beginning of the story, and adults, people who've come to a certain level of maturity, right, even well before adulthood, right, but reaching an age at which there's a change of perspective. How does that come about? It comes about at a moment when we ourselves are unlikely to remember exactly what happened. And so the telling of stories seems to be the only way to get at those moments, those aspects of human existence that aren't really accessible to literal storytelling. If we treat the story symbolically, then what we'll find is that it depicts coming of age as part of human existence, and precisely because it's going back to the very first human being, there was no one really to put into the parental role other than God. Right? But again, pressing that too literally gets one to conclusions which most people who claim to be literalists in their approach don't want to draw. And so you'll find that literalism in approaching the story has its limits. Once the disobedience is brought to light, there's curses upon the serpent and upon the ground. It's interesting to note what happens, right, when the accusations begin. The man blames the woman blames the snake, and the snake doesn't have a leg to stand on. This blame shifting is viewed as a consequence of sin, as part of the breakdown of human relationships as a result of alienation from God, which also leads to alienation from one another. And so I'd like to close with this thought. Isn't it ironic that the most popular way of reading the Adam and Eve story in certain circles is as an exercise in blame shifting? This story is not about us. It's not about what I'm like. It's about those two people whose fault it is that I'm the way I am, and that I've gotten into the trouble that I have, and that I face the problems that I do in everyday life. There's something ironic about the fact that those who read this story literalistically fail to realize that they're engaging in a kind of blame-shifting sort of reading, which reflects not what this story advocates, but what it views as a tragic consequence of the breakdown of human relationships. Something to think about as you reflect further on this story. There's a lot more detail that we could talk about, but I think that will do for today.